This film supplements the instructions for use and serves to aid understanding. This film is not a substitute for reading and understanding the instructions for use. It is also not a replacement for mandatory instructions or training courses.
My name's Marcus Benedict. I'm a global trainer at the Dräger Academy, and I would now like to introduce the BG ProAir. The BG ProAir is a closed-circuit breathing apparatus. To connect the breathing apparatus to yourself, you obviously need a full-face mask, in this case the FPS 7000 RP. If we have a closer look at the BG ProAir, first of all we will notice the housing. We turn it around, you will find the harness consisting out of a shoulder harness and a hip belt. Underneath the back pad we'll find the battery compartment which powers our monitoring unit. Here you see the breathing hoses would be the connection to your full-face mask. Let's now have a closer look inside. If we follow the breathing hoses, the directional valves in the mouthpiece actually make sure that the exhaled gas will end up in our CO2 absorber. Below the CO2 absorber you see the breathing bag, which some of us call the counter lung, being the flexible volume taking up the exhaled gas. If we follow the counter lung, we end up in the breathing gas cooler, which then supplies the gas back to the inhalation hose and to our connecting piece for the mask. The used up oxygen will be replenished from our oxygen cylinder via the pneumatics. The BG ProAir comes in different variants. We have a constant dosage of oxygen version and a version which is lung demand valve controlled. We have two different cooling methods. Here you see the regeneration phase change material cooler, but we also have as a variant our ice cooler where you would insert pre-frozen ice packs. As you might already know from the BG4, we have two different versions of a CO2 absorber. First of all, the absorber which is refillable, and secondly, our pre-filled version where you would use the same cover. Let's now assume that the BG ProAir has been used and potentially contaminated. We would have to disassemble it to give it a thorough cleaning. The same applies for the mask as well. But due to the contamination, you want to think about personal protective equipment. Goggles, breathing protection and gloves. Let's start with the disassembly. If the harness needs to be cleaned due to contamination, it can easily be taken off of the BG ProAir. Let's start by opening the loops which hold the breathing hoses to the harness, and then detach the loops for the monitoring unit. Underneath the hip belt you find a flap which allows you to open a clamp and then simply take off the hip belt. The shoulder harness is almost as easy, so just find the spring plates and pull the lower points of the shoulder harness off. And underneath the back flap you'll find it similar for the top of the shoulder harness. The harness can now be washed. Let's move on to the inside. So we take off the cover. We can undo the hinges on the back so that we can use the cover as a tray for all the components that need to go into the washing. We take out the cylinder by loosening the strap, opening the handwheel connection, and bear in mind to always put a protective cap on the cylinder and put it somewhere to a safe place to prevent the cylinder from flying. When we come to the breathing bag, we first take the spring bridge out of the housing. We take out the drain valve, and by pressing the blue buttons we can disconnect the breathing bag from the cooler and the CO2 absorber. The minimum valve is now inserted in the breathing bag, so carefully pull the breathing bag downwards not to interfere with the lever of the minimum valve. When we open the drain valve, we find our valve plate. The relief valve, again, we have two press buttons to pull out the relief valve, and we can open the cover here and drop out the valve disc. Before you remove the CO2 absorber, be aware that lime might be dripping out of the canister, so protect your hands wearing gloves. Let me first disconnect the measurement line, the oxygen supply line and the bypass line from the two canisters. By pressing the blue lever, I can lift the canister and put it into the lid. The bayonet nut gets simply opened and pushed on the hose, and by activating the flap, you can peel off the hose from the connector. Similar on our cooler. So we lift the cooler into the lid. You'll find the exact same bayonet nut. Again, use the flap to peel off the hose. We'll find the same bayonet nuts on the connecting piece. So open the nut on the one side. Using the flap, peel off the hose. And the same on the other side. We'll find the flap here. Take out the directional valves. And don't forget to take off the cap to give it a good cleaning. We have now disassembled the BG ProAir for cleaning. Bear in mind that all the components that come into contact with breathing gas needs to be cleaned before used again. Let me now demonstrate the cleaning and disinfecting of the single components of the breathing loop of the BG ProAir. But wait a second, we're having cleaning agents and disinfectants which might be harmful for your health. So think about personal protective equipment. You want eye protection and suitable gloves. It's very important that you have the right concentration for the cleaning agent and the disinfecting. So let me get the concentration for my cleaning agent first. And now the disinfectant. Before we can clean and disinfect the CO2 absorber, we have to get rid of the soda line. So let's open the lid by using the handles as a lever to lift out the cap. Let's take the sieve out. Let's throw away the fleece filter and the soda line. For our regeneration cooler, we again open the lid and take out the PCM stack. Our hoses, the connector, and for all the small parts, I would recommend a basket, especially the parts with the springs, the valve discs. And let's not forget the breathing bag. Depending on your contamination, it might be useful to use a brush or sponge. Before we move over to the disinfectant, we want to rinse it in clear tap water. Especially for the disinfecting process, not only the temperature of the bath and the concentration is of a crucial importance, but even more so the time of disinfecting. Make sure that you transport as little as possible water into your prepared concentration to not thin it. Let's now wait for the appropriate time for the disinfectant to actually do its work. After the appropriate time in the disinfectant, it is very important to rinse all the components in clear tap water to make sure that you don't have any residual disinfectant, which would not only be harming the material, but it would taste ugly. After the rinsing, we can use our lid again to transport all the components to our dryer. We can now take the single components to the dryer. After cleaning our single components, we need to thoroughly dry them. We want to have a drying temperature not more than 60 degrees Celsius. Try where possible to allow the water to drip off the components. Especially the hoses will take a long time drying if you dry them like that. Use gravity to get rid of some of the water. Now that we just cleaned and dried our parts, let's take them out of the dryer. But hold on a second. We've just cleaned them, so you don't want to recontaminate them. Either you wear gloves, or, as I just did, you just washed your hands. Here's all the small bits and pieces, our directional valves, the cap, the valve discs, the covers of the drain valve and the relief valve housing, our stack of the regeneration cooler, the breathing bag, CO2 absorber and cooler housing, the sieves and the connector, our two lids, and our dried hoses. We can now start reassembling the BG ProAir. Now that we've cleaned and thoroughly dried the BG ProAir, let me demonstrate how to get it ready to be used. First of all, I would like to demonstrate how to prepare our CO2 absorber. So we open the vac-sealed bag. Put the lid on, make sure that the indicator meets the indicator, and click the cams. Or we can use a refillable canister. For that, obviously, we need personal protective equipment, since we will now fill it with loose soda lime. So let me take out the sieves first and prepare myself. We need a dust mask, protective goggles, and gloves, because soda lime and humidity would generate a lime lye, which could actually etch your skin. You'll find a sieve which is marked with one line. Well, let's make this a Roman 1, which simply drops into the canister. You take your first fleece, put that into the canister, make sure that it sits at the bottom as nice as possible, and you start filling the canister. When you've reached almost half the filling, make sure that you give the canister a bit of shaking so that you get a nice settlement of the soda lime. You fill it to almost full and repeat that process. Your filling mark is around the edge of the canister, so you might have noticed that I still need a little bit more soda lime in this canister. Oh, don't be worried about the connector. We actually have feet that protect the connector from any hitting this table. Next, we put on another fleece filter. The sieve, which is marked with 2 lines, or make it a Roman 2, drops into the canister. Look for the mark on the canister, for the mark on the lid. Press the lid on the canister and tighten the clamps. Let's now reassemble the BG ProAir. Let me start with the connector. First of all, we will insert our directional valves. You might have noticed that the directional valves have 4 feet on one side and 3 feet on the other side. If you look into the connector, you will see 4 cavities on the inhalation side. So we insert the 4 feet into the 4 cavities and make sure that the corner is flush to the connector. On the other side, we have the 3 feet that we put into the 3 cavities and again insert it until it's flush with the connector. Attaching the hoses, remember the flap? There's actually a mark on the flap. So you will find a triangle on the connector, a triangle on the hose. We peel the hose over the connector, making sure that it sits all the way around the diameter. The flap goes into the cavity where it has the triangle, and now we insert and connect our bayonet nut. On the other side we see a circle, and on the hose flap you see a circle, but the rest is the same as before. We peel the hose over the connector, make sure that the flap sits in the cavity, and insert our bayonet nut. The hoses now go onto the cooler and onto the solunum canister. You might have noticed that I have the refillable canister already filled. So let me just sit that into the housing. Again, you will find a mark on the connector and a mark on the hose. So the circle goes to the circle, and the bayonet nut and the triangle goes to the triangle. If you want to make your life a little bit easier, you might want to make sure that the hoses are not kinked, so that you don't have any twisters in the hoses that you have to detach it later on. Make sure that the hose is all flush and the bayonet nut. Now we tilt the cooler into the housing. You hear the clicking of the blue flap. Canister, the click, the oxygen connection, and my measurement line. And I reattach my bypass line. Let's now concentrate on the breathing bag. Let me start with my relief valve. So I take a valve disc, make sure that the pin sits in the middle. Before you put the cap back on, make sure that the spring has exactly 1 coil behind the little feet. The spring goes into the middle of the valve disc and you click the connector shut and just press it onto the breathing bag. On the drain valve, you take the valve disc and the lid, again making sure that 1 coil is behind the feet of the spring, and click that shut. When you insert the breathing bag, you'll find a pocket right here which needs to be pushed over the lever of our minimum valve. So I carefully feed the lever of the minimum valve into the pocket. I attach the drain valve into the connector and push my click-on connections on the cooler and on the solunum canister. The spring bridge goes onto the 2 hinges, left and right, and simply clicks into the housing, left and right. The cylinder, take the cap off, reconnect the hand wheel, and by all means, it's a hand wheel, so only attach it hand tight. Our cylinder strap. The buckle of the cylinder strap should be between the breathing bag and the spring bridge, not to interfere with the lid or with the breathing bag. The cap obviously goes onto the connector to the mask. And we now click the hinges onto the housing, close the set, and now let's reattach the harness. Let me start with the shoulder harness. So you find the spring plates, locate the strap, and just click it in. And the same on the bottom. The notch is the top position of the hip belt, so we put the hip belt back onto the swivel. Press it in until you can see the clamp. And insert the clip. Click in the monitoring unit and the shoulder strap, which fixes the monitoring unit with the chest belt. Let's reattach the hose loops. And always make sure that all the straps are to the maximum position so that even larger users can slip into the set easily. The set is now ready to be tested. Before we use a BG ProAir, we have to do a visual inspection, a functional test, and a leak test. The unit that I'm testing here is the variant with a lung demand valve oxygen supply. For the test, I will use my RZ7000. So let me open the box, activate the pump, and switch on the RZ7000. I always like to open the hose loops to have a kink-free access of the hoses. Let's connect the BG ProAir to my RZ7000. Take off the cover. And let's start with the exhalation valve test. To test the exhalation valve, we have to blank the inhalation hose. So I just squeeze the inhalation hose, switch to negative pressure, press the pump, and by letting go of the pump, I generate a negative pressure. You want to see at least minus 10 millibar. Similar on the inhalation valve, we now blank off the exhalation hose, switch to positive pressure, and by pressing, I now generate a positive pressure of at least 10 millibar. Oh, do you hear that? The BG ProAir now identified my change of pressure as a breathing and gave me the no oxygen warning. That will actually quiet down again after 10 seconds. But let me carry on with the test. I would like to test the drain valve now. For that, I switch on positive pressure. I use the lever to blank off the breathing bag so that my relief valve doesn't open, and inflate the bag by using the pump. The The drain valve is supposed to open between 10 and 25 millibars. Did you hear that? Well, if your workshop is too noisy, just monitor the display and you can see no further increase of pressure, then the drain valve must have opened. Let's carry on with the low pressure leak test of the complete breathing loop. So I switch the RZ to leak test. I bleed the pressure down to roughly 7.5 millibar. Let it stabilize for a couple of seconds. And by pressing OK, I start the test. The test will run for 1 minute and the maximum allowable pressure drop would be 1 millibar per minute. We now want to test the relief valve, but the relief valve is currently blanked off. So I need to go to quick venting to bleed the system, put the lever into the parking position, switch on to positive pressure again, inflate the breathing bag until you hear the relief valve opening, or as before on the drain valve, do not see a further increase of low pressure. The opening pressure of the relief valve has to be between 4 and 8 millibar. To test the no oxygen warning, we want to simulate a breathing. For that, we have our RZ7000 on positive pressure, and by pumping, we're now simulating an inhalation and exhalation. I hear and see the no oxygen warning. That will quiet down again after 10 seconds. The next test that we will do is the pre-flush test. The LDV version of the BG ProAir will flush the whole breathing loop with oxygen when opening the cylinder valve. To perform that test, we want to switch off the monitoring unit first, because as soon as the pre-flush has finished, the monitoring unit will offer me the option to do a high pressure leak test. I will do both tests straight after another now. So let me start by opening the cylinder valve. You hear the pre-flush filling the system. You hear the startup of the monitoring unit. The pre-flush will stop roughly after 5 seconds. And I now start the high pressure leak test. It tells me to close the cylinder valve. And since I don't have a constant dosage, I need to acknowledge that. It now performs a high pressure leak test for roughly 15 seconds. High pressure leak test passed. To test the bypass, we have to open the cylinder valve again. And by simply pressing the bypass, we can hear the rush of oxygen and see that the breathing bag inflates. To test the minimum valve, we now go to quick venting on our RZ7000. We see that the breathing bag is now emptying via the RZ7000. And as soon as we hear the hissing of the minimum valve, we have to make sure that it activates between 0.5 and 3 millibar. If the hissing is too quiet, just monitor your display. My display is keeping on 1.8 millibars. I hear the hissing of the minimum valve, so it actually has activated. The last test that we do is a residual pressure warning. I switch to leak test on the RZ7000. I close my cylinder valve. And since on the LDV version of the BG ProAir, the pressure will stay, I now need to simulate a use of oxygen by very carefully pressing the bypass. The warning should activate below 55 bar. The warning comes, so I can now finish the test by pressing the bypass all the way to bleed all the pressure. Switching off the monitoring unit by pressing the two buttons for 3 seconds, disconnecting the BG ProAir from my RZ7000, closing the cap, reattaching the lid to the hinges, closing the lid, and reattaching my hose loops. The set is now ready to be used.